Hi, welcome to Time Flies. I'm Mick Smith and my guest today is Professor Peter Hennessy. Professor Hennessy, you're one of Britain's leading post-war historians. We've had 60 years now of Queen Elizabeth II, 6 decades. Which, in your view, was the most important of those decades?
Well, I suppose in the big scheme of things, the Cold War ones were, because our country was an extraordinary paradox. We were becoming more affluent the first time we became a mass consumption society, late 50s, early 60s. And yet, anybody reared in the shadow of the bomb, as I was, post-war baby, knew that it could all end in one afternoon. So we could go from being a much more decent society, much better fed, much better cared for, to a shriveled and irradiated ruin in the space of an afternoon. And that didn't half concentrate your minds. Didn't think about it all the time, but one certainly did at the time, like the Cuban Missile Crisis, October 1962. So in many ways those Cold War years were absolutely critical. But there again, since the Cold War ended, which is the greatest shared miracle of our lifetime, it's not exactly been tranquil, has it?
Indeed. But those 6 decades have also been the 6 decades of your life, haven't they?
Yeah.
Really? So how do you think your own personal experience of Britain and being brought up and living in Britain has affected what you've written?
Very much so. My fellow historians, to whom I'm devoted, quite often are very amused about the degree of autobiography I put in my pages, and I can't help it really, because I belong to the Max Bygrave School of History. I want to tell you a story. And when you tell a story of your own country in your own time, you're bound to put in the experience of yourself, people you were at school and college with, your own family and your friends. And if you were there and you can remember the mood and the atmosphere, it gives it texture. But it's a terrible temptation. The autobiographical impulse has got to be curbed, and I usually fail.
Going back to the great Labour governments of the 70s, 60s and 70s, Labour...
What was great about them?
Well...
The great Labour government was
compared to some we've had since.
The great Labour government was the one I was born into, Mr. Attlee's, 45-51. Mind you, I was very fond of Harold Wilson and Jim, yeah. But they were not gold-plated.
No, they certainly weren't. And one of the things that they did has resurfaced recently, and that's Shirley Williams and axing the grammar schools. Do you think that's restricted social mobility? I mean, we have 2 public school boys now leading the country.
Yeah. It's one of the great British debates, class and status. And if I had a magic wand, Mick, what I would do is I would wave it over that part of our country's life where we put our class and status obsessions into education where they simply don't belong. Now, what the structures are, what the best structures are, I don't know. The grammar school was made for me, my one in Gloucestershire, Marling School in Stroud. But there were a lot of people that didn't get anywhere near the chance that I did, and that was a great worry, and of course it still is. But the grammar schools most certainly were a remarkable ladder of social mobility, and there's never been anything like them before, since they became free to everybody from 1944 onwards, that could get through the scholarship, as we called it, and there's been nothing like them since. But I was always aware that there was a large swathe of our country that wasn't benefiting from it, so I'm torn about all that. But I'm a classic product of the grammar schools, there is no question about that.
And we had one of Mrs. Thatcher's ministers saying that David Cameron was a shallow, callow sort of a guy, never got the critical decisions right. Do you think that's fair?
No, I don't think so. It's far too soon to say. People are terribly... I don't want to sound like his press agent, but I've talked to him now and again, and he's intelligent and decent. And of course it doesn't look too wonderful at the moment, but there again, what governments do 2 years in. There's a kind of almost an iron law of politics, that the bags of manure are opened over their heads about 2 years in. And the size of the majority doesn't always make that much difference. And also, the trouble is with British politics is not since August the 4th, 1914, the day the Great War broke out, has a British Chancellor of the Exchequer and a British Prime Minister be able to move the world economy. And you have to pretend very often that you can, but of course you can't. And the greater cataclysmic forces of the movements in the world economy make it very difficult. But politicians have to tell themselves a bit of a fairy story. They wouldn't get out of bed in the morning, would they, if they realised just how relatively powerless they are. So I'm much more sympathetic to them than you might imagine.
Funny question, really. Who's your favourite political satirist?
George Orwell.
George Orwell.
Animal Farm. It was the most biting and the most effective satire of all of them. Takes the palm even now. Wasn't man for jokes, George Orwell, but he couldn't half do political satire.
Okay, that's it. And time flies when?
When one's gossiping with you, Mick.
Thank you very much.